What's up guys, Kavika here with 9th Ave Studio. Today we are going over exposure. Okay, so photography theory 101. Photography is all about light. And I know that sounds like some ethereal thing that photographers say, but it's actually very practical because the only thing that is going to hit your camera sensor is light. We have to control how that light hits the sensor, and we do that through the camera settings. We use different lenses, we use light modifiers and composition, all to shape how the light hits your sensor. Almost any camera that you buy these days is going to have a built-in light meter, and that's awesome because you used to have a separate device. You would put it in the scene, it would measure the amount of light in the scene, and then you change the settings on your camera based on what the readout was. Now it's all built in. The light meter readout on your camera might look like this. It might have a 0 in the middle and negative numbers to the left, positive numbers to the right, and then tick marks beneath it. Each number is called a stop, and that's the unit of measurement that we use to measure light. If your exposure is at 0, then generally you have a properly exposed image, or at least your camera thinks so. If your camera says that you're +1, then you're 1 stop overexposed. If it's -2, then you're 2 stops underexposed. That's where they get the terms exposing to the left and exposing to the right. For most cameras, the way to activate the light meter is to press the shutter button about halfway down. They actually call that metering. So between your camera and your lens, there's 3 main things that affect the way that light hits your sensor. And that's called the exposure triangle. The 3 corners of the triangle are aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. So number 1, aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening that light passes through in order to hit your sensor. Obviously, the bigger the opening, the more light is going to pass through. The second thing that aperture controls is your depth of field. With a very wide aperture, you get a very shallow depth of field. So it's super popular for like portrait photographers. They want to separate the subject from the background, so the subject will be in focus and the background will be blurry. On the other hand, landscape photographers sometimes like to use a smaller aperture, which allows them to get the foreground in focus as well as the background. Aperture is read out in f-stops, so a lot of times you'll see an F and a number, or F/a number. If you see F and then a very small number, say 1.2, that means you have a very wide aperture. And then when you have F and then a high number like F11, that's a very small aperture. It's a little difficult to count stops with aperture because it's not a linear system. It doesn't just go like 1, 2, 3, 4. It actually goes 2, 2.8, 4.0, 5.6, 8.0, 11. I'm sure I'll make a video at one point explaining why it does that, but for now, let's just leave it at that. The second corner of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that your sensor is exposed to light. The longer you expose the sensor to light, the more possibility you have of motion blur. So on one hand, you have people like sports photographers. They're shooting these athletes that are moving really, really fast, and they need a shutter speed fast enough to freeze the moment in time. On the other hand, if I'm shooting a waterfall, I might want a longer shutter speed because then I can simulate the motion of the water coming down. For most photography, the shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. And then other times it's measured in whole seconds for longer exposures. So on your camera, you might see something like 1/200. That's a 200th of a 200th of a That's a 200th of a second that your sensor is exposed to light. Shutter speed is a little bit easier to count stops with. Because going up 1 stop is doubling the amount of light, with shutter speed, all you gotta do is double the amount of time that the shutters open. So if you're shooting at a 100th of a second, just double it. Shoot at a 50th of a second. So between aperture and shutter speed, you can kind of think of it like as a water hose, where aperture is the size of the hose, and then the shutter speed is how long you leave the faucet open. So now, the third and final corner of the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO is the sensitivity setting of the actual sensor on your camera. Most sensors have a base ISO of 100. So at ISO 100, light will hit the sensor, and then the camera will create an image that represents that exact amount of light. But if you have an ISO that's higher than that, light is going to hit the sensor, but then your camera is going to amplify that light and artificially make the image look like it was exposed more. So essentially, you're not increasing the amount of light, you're actually just amplifying the signal. Generally speaking, the higher you increase your ISO, the more you introduce noise into your image. It's kind of like when you turn the volume up on a stereo. If you turn it too high, you end up getting distortion. Same with your sensor. If you turn the ISO up too high, you're going to introduce way too much noise into your image. And just like buying a better quality stereo, you can buy a camera with a better quality sensor. So you have more leverage to turn the volume up without introducing too much noise. ISO is pretty easy to count stops too, because it's just like shutter speed, except it starts at 100. So to increase one stop over 100, all you gotta do is times it by 200. So that, in a nutshell, is the exposure triangle. Hope you guys learned something. If you guys have requests for specific content, definitely comment below. And if you want to see more stuff like this, go ahead and subscribe. If you guys are curious what kind of gear I'm using, I've put most of the links below. So thanks for watching, guys. Again, I'm Kavika with 9th Ave Studio. Shoo!